Hey everyone, this is part 2 of my video on compositional layout and diffable data sources. So in the last video we saw how we can build the layout for this collection view using compositional layout, but what we did is we used the older APIs for populating our data, for example number of sections, self-format, etc. So now in this video what we'll be looking at is we'll be learning how we can use the new diffable data source APIs for populating data into our collection view. So let's begin. Okay, so the first thing which we do is we create a data source which will be of type UICollectionView Diffable DataSource, and it is a generic and it takes two arguments, a section and an item, both of these which we will be creating right now. So a section, both of these are essentially hashable items that we will be using for identifying our particular section and the items that go in our section, each section. Okay, so for example, let's take the section can be an enum. We'll make it hashable, and the section will be an enum, and our item will be a struct, also hashable. Okay, now I'll just mention the UID of this item just so that we have an unique identifier for this. And as mentioned before, the item is essentially the content of the cell that we are going to show here. So in our case, what we did is we were only using the colors that we were passing for the background, right? So I'll just create a property for the color here as well. But yeah, by default I'll give it a color of clear. I'll give it a clear color. Now the section, let me just make it clear. So for example, in our case we have 1, 2, 3 sections, right? We have 3 sections in our view, in our collection view. So I'll be essentially making all of these values. Okay, I'll just be naming first, second, third. That's how I'll be naming the section. So in this case, what you have to do is you have to create an enum case for every single section that you want in your collection view. Okay, now each section will be having, for each section I'll be passing the item as an associated value. Why I do this, I'll explain it, but for now just follow me on this and we'll see how we can use this value right here. Okay, so this is our data source is pretty much done. Now what we will be doing is, let's see, we have our collection view build set up right here. Now we basically want to eliminate this. Okay, but before that let's write code for the diffable data sources. Let's create a function called setup data source, and I'll be calling this function from view.load. So in this, let's first create a function for creating our data source. In this, what we do is we create the data source. So here we will be having UI collection view diffable data source, and here you can see there is this initializer right here where we pass our collection view and a cell provider. So now if you look at this closely, this cell provider resembles our cell for the VAT right here, right? So this is similar. So what I'll be doing is I simply take this code and put it in here. Okay, it does the same thing. What I'm doing is I'm essentially dequeuing a cell with my particular identifier, and here I'll be taking the cell color for this particular case. Okay, since we are inside a closure, I'll have to reference self. Let's use weak self to avoid memory leaks. Okay, all right, so now what we are doing is we are essentially creating a cell like this, and let's not forget our supplementary views. We'll also have to create them. So let's set the supplementary view provider to this closure, which will also take a collection view, the kind, and the index path. Okay, and what we'll do is we'll just take this code here and paste it right here. Okay, so our data source is set up. let's call this here. Now we will have a function. Let's create a function called update data source. Now that our data source is set up, we have our data source ready, but we haven't applied it to our collection view yet. So let's write the function for updating our data source. Now how we update this data source is the data that we have currently, the latest data. So we call it a snapshot. So all the data which is being populated inside this collection view is called a snapshot. And whenever we want to update this value, we just have to apply the snapshot. I'll show you how exactly that is done. So for example, now what I want to do is, since here my dependency is on this particular array, what I want to do is I want to create another variable which will be exactly holding the values of sections. Let's call it section data. And section data is essentially a 2D array of sections. Okay, so the first section is going to be this thing. So based on our new data, what we'll do is the first section is called first, and the item the first item that goes inside our first section has a color of yellow. Okay, this exactly. And as we can see, our first section has 4 items. So we copy this and paste it 4 times. So this is our first section. And now for our cell, what I'll do is I will be using this data instead. Now there's an issue. Now there's an issue that we can't exactly access the color, and that's because we are now using an associated value. So what I'll be doing is I'll simply switch on I'll first get the section, which is this. Now I'm going to switch on my section. Let's see the first item. The first item is going to be, let's call it data. And now the cell color, I'll just simply take this value, color. Fine. The same thing I'm going to copy for the other cases as well. For now, just set a default color. Fine. So now we have so this is set up. Now let's try to write the code for applying our snapshot. So our snapshot is going to be, so let's create our snapshot first. Snapshot equals ns diffable DataSource snapshot section item. And now what we will be doing is we will be it's a snapshot, right? So the snapshot will basically be for section in section data. Now the snapshot that we will be applying on our data source, apply snapshot, animate difference is true. Okay, so this snapshot is going to be applied, and I'll be extracting data from our section data, which is this, and I'll be placing it in my snapshot. All right, so what I'll do is, so I'm iterating over my section data, and now I need the section name first, which is, if let section name equals section Alright, so now what we are doing is we are essentially creating a snapshot of our items, and we're iterating over our section data array which we have created above. And then what we take is that we take the first item as a section name, and for every single item we are basically parsing out the items inside the section. Then we apply the section name, then we append the section, and we append the items, and we append them to this particular section. Alright, so now that we have created, what we can do is we can just comment out this code, and we'll also need to comment out this code. Now let's run this and check. Right, so we'll have a single section which is essentially the first section. Now we want to build another section. Now we want to create the other two sections, right? Okay, so now that we have this section created, so let's also create the other sections that we had. Then let's see. Okay, so now there's one more thing which we need to do. So in the compositional layout section, let's check our layout. Previously what we had done is that we had used the section index as our parameter for laying out the sections. Now since we have used this section enum right here, we will need to use this instead of the indexes. So let's try to get our section enum from this, like this Datasource dot section identifier for section, and then we iterate on our section enum, and if it's a first, I don't need this associated value. If it's second, then we use this layout. If it's the third, we're going to be using this layout. Let's see the layout now. Alright, so the layout is not being generated because we have only used the first. Right, so let's write out the other cases as well. Same thing will go for third. Right, and similarly we will need to do the same for this. Let's run this and check. Right, so now we have two sections being rendered because we have defined two sections in our section data array. Right, now let's create a third section as well, which was the grid type thing. Yeah, so now we have all the three sections rendered, and now we can safely get rid of this particular array which we don't need anymore, and we have successfully shifted to our new array. Right, so now what we can do is, this is fine and all, there's one more added advantage of using diffable data sources. So for diffable data sources, every single item is an item of its own. So if we add or subtract any item in this list, the changes will be automatically animated. We will not need to hit collectionview.reload data like we used to before. We just need to update our snapshot and the changes will be automatically animated. So let's try to see this in action. So let's try to so what I'll be doing is I'll be creating a bar button item on top for adding an element to this grid. Okay, and we'll see how the changes are animated upon adding a new cell. Right, so let's try to do that. So initially, as you can see, we don't see the navigation bar. So let's do something about that. Let's add the navigation bar first. So let's embed this in the navigation controller. All right, and as we can see, we have the navigation controller embedded. Let's create a function called setupNav. Okay, so let's create a private func setupNav. Now the setupNav function, let's give it a title. Let's call it Diffable. Now let's add a bar button item. All right, so we have this button ready. Let's add it as a navigation item. Let's also create a button for subtracting an item, for removing an item from our grid. So let's call it minus item. And let's add it here, left bar button item. Okay, fine. Let's first run this and check what is rendered, if it's running fine or not. It's running fine. We have two buttons for adding and for subtracting, right? For add item, let's so what I'll be doing is, I have my section data here. I'll be creating a new item. Color is going to be, let's give it a different color from this. Let's give it a color of system blue. Okay, and I'll simply append this in my in the second position, and I'll update my data source. Let's run this and check what happens. See, as we add a new item, it gets added to my section with animation, right? The same thing we can do. Let's try something. Let's try to remove an item from this section. So now I'll be checking if section data dot count is greater than 0. In that case, section data remove last. Let's try this. Oh, oops, I forgot to update the data source. So now let's try once again. Okay, so now as you can see, the items get added with animation and they also get subtracted with animation, all thanks to Diffable DataSource, right? So we don't need this code. Let's get rid of our older code as well, right? That's it. So if you want animations like this, and if you want something easier to set up, right, so you can just use this new APIs right there. So thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.